The blizzard had started unexpectedly. Mark had been driving through the mountains, heading back to the cabin he and his friends had rented for the weekend. The snowstorm wasn't in the forecast, but within an hour, the road had become nearly impassable. His car's headlights barely cut through the swirling white, and the tires struggled to grip the icy pavement. When his car finally skidded to a stop, it was dead silent except for the howling wind outside. Mark tried restarting the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. His phone had no signal, and the road behind him had long disappeared under a thick blanket of snow. He cursed under his breath and scanned his surroundings. That's when he saw a faint light glowing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It wasn't from his cabin, it was too far off the main road. But it was his only option. Bundling up in his coat and scarf, Mark grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the bitter cold. The wind cut through him like knives, and his boots crunched loudly in the fresh snow. The trek felt longer than it should have, the light always seeming just out of reach. By the time he reached the source, his fingers were numb and his breath came in short, freezing bursts. The light belonged to an old, weathered house, its roof sagging under the weight of years in snow. Icicles hung like daggers from the eaves, and the windows were fogged over. Still, smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the warm glow of a lantern spilled out onto the snow. Mark knocked on the door, desperate for help. After a long pause, it creaked open on its own. "Hello," he called, stepping inside. The air inside was cold, much colder than he'd expected. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern on a wooden table. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Then he saw the footprints. They weren't his, they led from the doorway to a dark hallway at the back of the house. "Is someone here?" Mark called again, his voice echoing eerily. There was no response, but something about the house felt alive. The wind outside had stopped howling, leaving an oppressive silence that made Mark's heart race. He followed the footprints cautiously, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The hallway led to a narrow staircase, its steps groaning under his weight as he climbed. At the top, a door stood ajar, revealing a bedroom coated in frost. The bed was neatly made, but the room felt abandoned, like it had been frozen in time. Then he saw the figure. At first, he thought it was a shadow, but as his flashlight passed over it, he realized it was a woman. She stood facing the corner, her back to him, her long hair draped over a tattered white gown. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. Mark stepped closer, his boots crunching on the icy floor. "Are you okay?" As he reached out to touch her shoulder, she turned. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth twisted into a grin far too wide for her face, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Before Mark could scream, she lunged, her icy hands gripping his arms with impossible strength. The last thing Mark felt was the cold and all-consuming, unnatural cold that spread through his body, freezing him from the inside out. Days later, when the blizzard cleared, rescuers found Mark's car abandoned on the road. But they never found him. Locals, however, know the truth. That house in the woods has claimed many souls over the years, and on stormy nights, the faint glow of its lantern still lures the lost. Here is the second story, The Frozen Warning. The town of Cold Hollow had seen its fair share of brutal winters, but this one was different. The snow came early, blanketing the valley in icy silence. The locals whispered about an ancient curse that awakened during harsh winters, a warning to stay indoors after dark. But Thomas, an outsider and skeptic, wasn't one for old wives' tales. Thomas had moved to Cold Hollow a few months ago to escape the chaos of city life. He had rented a remote cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. To him, the solitude was peaceful, even if the townsfolk's superstitions were a bit much. One snowy evening, Thomas sat by the fireplace, sipping coffee and reading. The wind howled outside, and the heavy snowfall obscured the world beyond his frosted window. As he turned a page, a faint knocking echoed through the cabin. He froze, his mind racing. The cabin was miles from any neighbors, and Visitors were unheard of, especially in a storm. The knock came again, soft but deliberate. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The icy wind hit him immediately, and the beam of his flashlight revealed only swirling snow and darkness. No footprints, no signs of life. "Hello," he called, his voice barely audible over the storm. There was no response. Shaking his head, he shut the door and locked it. He dismissed it as the wind rattling the wooden frame and returned to his book. But as he settled back into his chair, the knock came again, louder this time. Annoyed and unnerved, Thomas flung the door open, prepared to confront whoever was playing tricks. But again, there was nothing, just the snow piling up in drifts. As he stood there, his flashlight caught something strange in the distance. At the edge of the tree line, a figure stood motionless. It was hard to make out through the swirling snow, but it appeared to be a person, their head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Do you need help?" Thomas shouted, but the figure didn't move. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his coat and boots and stepped outside. The snow was deep, nearly up to his knees, and the wind was relentless. He trudged toward the figure, keeping the flashlight steady. As he got closer, his stomach sank. It wasn't a person, it was a crude snowman, its head cocked to one side with jagged sticks for arms. The eyes were black stones, and the mouth was a twisted, toothy grin made of shards of ice. A chill ran through him, colder than the wind biting at his skin. He hadn't built the snowman, and there were no footprints around it. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding, and turned toward the cabin. That's when he saw the more snowmen. They dotted the landscape, emerging from the storm like silent sentinel. Each one faced the cabin, their grotesque faces leering at him. Panicking, Thomas ran back inside and bolted the door. He closed all the curtains, trying to block out the sight of those unnerving figures. But even with the curtains drawn, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then, the knocking started again. This time, it came from every wall, every window, as if a dozen hands were pounding in unison. The cabin groaned under the pressure, and the lights flickered. Thomas grabbed his phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. The wind howled louder, and he swore he could hear whispers within it, low, guttural voices calling his name. The pounding grew more frantic, and the cabin's temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the walls and windows, and his breath came out in visible puffs. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The knocking ceased. Thomas cautiously approached the window and peeked out. The snowmen were gone. The storm had eased, leaving an eerie stillness. Relief washed over him until he turned around. Standing in the center of the room was a single snowman, its icy grin glistening in the dim light. The last thing Thomas saw was its arm, a jagged, frozen limb reaching for him. The next day, the locals found his cabin buried in snow, the door wide open. Inside, there was no sign of Thomas, just a puddle of water on the floor, and outside, a new snowman, its grin sharper than ever. Here is the third story. Whispering Wind. The town of Frosthaven was no stranger to harsh winters, but this year felt different. The snow fell heavier, the winds howled louder, and the nights stretched longer, as if the season itself was alive. Nestled deep in the woods, the old Birchwood Lodge had stood abandoned for years, shrouded in rumors of strange disappearances. No one dared approach it in winter, no one except for Claire. Claire was a freelance photographer, always chasing the perfect shot. She had heard of Birchwood Lodge through an online forum. Hauntingly beautiful, someone had described it. Others warned her not to go, but Claire wasn't one to heed warning. She packed her camera, layers of warm clothing, and enough supplies for a 2-day trip. The lodge was a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. As she trudged through the knee-deep snow, the woods grew eerily silent. The only sounds were her footsteps crunching on the frozen ground and the occasional creak of tree branches weighed down by snow. When she finally reached the lodge, the sight took her breath away. The massive wooden structure stood cloaked in white, its pointed roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The windows, frosted over, reflected the pale gray sky. She snapped a few photos, marveling at the building's eerie charm. Pushing open the heavy front door, Claire was greeted by the stale smell of rot and cold air. The interior was dark, save for the dim light streaming through broken windows. Furniture lay scattered and decayed, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. Perfect, she thought. As she explored the lodge, her camera clicked incessantly. She captured the grand staircase, the tattered remains of a chandelier, and the haunting emptiness of the dining hall. But as she wandered deeper into the lodge, she began to notice odd things. Faint footprints in the dust that didn't belong to her, doors that were open when she swore she had closed them, and a subtle yet persistent feeling of being watched. Shaking it off as her imagination, she decided to set up camp in one of the smaller rooms. Nightfall came quickly, and with it, the wind picked up, wailing against the lodge like a tortured soul. As Claire lay in her sleeping bag, reviewing the photos on her camera, she froze. One of the images, a shot of the staircase, had something she hadn't noticed before. A shadowy figure stood at the top of the stairs, barely visible in the dim light. Her heart raced. She immediately flipped through the rest of the photos, and her stomach dropped. The figure appeared in several of them, always just barely in the frame, standing in the corner of the dining hall, lurking near a window, watching. Suddenly, the wind outside shifted, carrying with it a faint sound like whispers. Claire sat up, her breath visible in the freezing air. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. She grabbed her flashlight and scanned the room. The beam trembled in her shaky hand as it passed over the rotting furniture and peeling wallpaper. Then she saw it. In the corner of the room, where no one had been moments ago, stood a figure cloaked in shadow. Its face was indistinct, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. The whispers intensified, echoing in her mind. Claire bolted, leaving her camera and supplies behind. She ran down the hall, her flashlight flickering. The walls seemed to close in on her, the whispers chasing her, growing louder with every step. When she reached the front door, she yanked it open and plunged into the snowstorm. The wind was deafening now, but the whispers followed her, circling her like predators. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the woods. Gasping for breath, she looked back. The lodge was barely visible through the snow, but in one of the windows, she swore she saw the figure watching her, its shadowy form perfectly still. Claire never returned to Frosthaven. She left her camera behind, but some say it still sits in that decaying lodge, the memory card holding proof of the thing that lives there. And on nights when the wind howls through the woods, the whispers can still be heard, calling out to anyone foolish enough to listen.